All right, guys, let's get started. Oh, Fremantle, even better. All right, so welcome everybody. This is your Australian-inspired Brewers Workshop. So just really quick, I'm Sarah Robb. I work for Line Little World Beverages, which is a group of breweries here in the UK and Australia. So we are Australian owned by Lion. And within the UK, we've got 4 Pure Brewing Company in London, Magic Rock in Huddersfield, and then, of course, the beautiful Little Creatures venue at King's Cross, also in London. Hopefully you guys managed to come down and visit us. If you're not visiting us in Australia, then that's even better, and I'll be even more jealous. But yeah, so I started off as a brewer, then took on some sustainability roles, as sustainability is a very big deal for Line Little World Beverages. We pride ourselves on it quite a bit. Also do a lot of DE&I work with the business, and then I've also become the sensory lead. So that's all things to do with how the beer is tasting, looking, smelling, and we'll do some of that today. So I get a fun job, pretty lucky to have the job I do, so I quite enjoy it, and hopefully you guys do too. I mentioned it just as we started, but if you haven't put your beers in the fridge, please do so now. If you've gotten them in time, hopefully everybody has, just to make sure that when we are doing the tasting, we're really tasting the beer as it's supposed to taste. So if you haven't already, please put them in the fridge, and yeah, we will get started. So just quickly, today's agenda. So we'll touch on, what's in our pints. So when we go down to the pub or having one at home or at a tap room, if you're lucky enough to go to a tap room now that COVID's over and we can finally go out and about, what exactly is in those pints. So we'll quickly touch on what's in our pint, how it's made, and then we'll talk about how Australia has to do with the pints that we get even here in England, and what their contribution is to the craft beer scene. And then we'll talk about their craft beer industry, and then we will go into the tasting. So hopefully it'll be a bit of information, and at the very end we'll do some beer tasting, and we'll talk about in general how to taste our beers, and also the best way and best places, and hopefully we'll get some interaction from you guys as well. So please do keep talking in the chat if anybody wants to join me on screen later on when we do the actual tasting. That's always way more fun for everybody, and we can sort of chat through, as tasting a beer and everybody's taste is very unique, so it's always good fun to talk through with people about what they're feeling and tasting. So how many people are aware of what goes into our pints? So whether it's the brewing process or the ingredients, have we got any ideas of maybe what the core ingredients are to make beer, or what goes on to get us our delicious beverage at the end of the day? You can pretty much put anything in beer these days. There was a mushroom beer I tasted not so long ago. That was quite interesting. So the brewing process is a bit of an interesting one. It's effectively just hops. Yep, hops is one. Water's another. I can see them coming through. Yeah, hops, wheat, water. Brilliant. Andrew and Laura are on it. That's exactly what it is. Well done, guys. So water, malt, hops, and yeast. So malt is a bit of a funny one. So malt is actually a process. So as we can see here, the first step is we've got our grain silo. In that grain silo, you'll have different grains or cereals, or you could even have rice in there depending on where you are in the world. But all of that grain will go through the malting process, and that's what gives us malt. And so going through the malting process, effectively what we're doing is we're just trying to trick the grain into thinking, that it's going through germination to get as much sugar produced in it as possible so that we can use it later on. So once we've come up with a recipe, because brewing is just like cooking pretty much any dish at home, you've got to come up with a recipe depending on what you want at the end of the day. So we'll get our grain together, we'll mill it to break up the outer husks to make it easier for us to access those sugars. And then what we're going to do is we're going to add water to it, which we talked about as well as one of our core ingredients. So water is really important for us to get the beer that we want at the end of the day as well. And so in the mash tun there, the third vessel or the third little image, we're going to add in our malt in our water, and we're going to create what is known as the mash, which is why it's called mashing and why it's called a mash tun. So in that, effectively, you've then got a really porridgey consistency. It literally looks and smells maybe not exactly like porridge, but very similar. And what's happening in here is we're cooking it, and what we're doing is we're releasing the sugars that are in the grain and in our malt into the water. So by doing that, obviously we're releasing the sugar out for us to then hopefully get it in the later stage. So in the next one, then we go into the lauter tun, and then we do what's called lautering. So in the lauter tun, what happens is there's a false bottom, which is effectively like a big sieve at the bottom, and we're going to rinse our mash, our grain, our porridgey substance. We're going to rinse that with just clean water in the hopes of extracting as much of that sugary water as possible. And then when we do what we're doing there, so by rinsing it off, we're trying to collect as much of that as possible for later on. And we're also, because of that sieve, we're separating our solid from our liquid. So that solid is then obviously the leftover grains, which is then referred to as spent grains. And what we're going to do with the spent grains is often, especially in all of our breweries, we then donate it either to farmers to use or to a biofuel company, or here in London, it also goes to an insect company. So they take it off then to obviously be reused, repurposed, which is fantastic because we no longer need it. But what we have gotten out of that is this like amazing sugary liquid. And so that liquid is then called wort. And then in the next image at the very end, you can see where it says brewing. So what we're doing there is we're going to boil it. And by boiling the wort, we're sterilizing it, and we're breaking down some compounds that we no longer want. That could make our beer taste a bit, tannicky maybe later on down the line, which nobody really likes. So we're going to bypass that and boil it. And this is the first stage where we can add our hops. So hops is another one that we've talked about. So we've now got 3 ingredients, which is brilliant. And so you can think of hops like adding seasoning to dishes. So different hops give you different flavor profiles. And by adding it here in the brew house, we can add bitterness. So as I said, that wort is a really sweet liquid. And if you were to just have beer that was just pure malty wort water, it would probably be quite sweet. So by adding hops in, we can change the flavor of it slightly, make it a bit more bitter, maybe a bit more palatable, and obviously, change our recipe and get us different styles of hops that we want at the end of the day. And so once it's finished the brewing process and it's cooked away and we've gotten it to where we want it to be, we're obviously checking it at every stage for different markers. We're then going to cool it down and then add it to a fermentation vessel. So in a fermentation vessel, it does what it says. We're going to start fermenting that grain, that wort, and we're doing that by adding yeast. So now we've got all of our core ingredients, which is great, and they're all going to start sort of doing their own little thing to give us the delicious beverages that we want at the end of the day. So when we add the yeast, this is when alcohol finally starts getting produced. So in the top level of that image, there's no alcohol yet, and only in the bottom do we start getting alcohol. And that's because all yeast wants to do is eat sugar. So that's why we've created this sugary, amazing liquid for it. And so all it's going to do is eat sugar, replicate itself, and eat some more. That's all it wants to do. Its primary purpose in life. And lucky enough for us, that results in a byproduct of ethanol and CO2, which is how we get alcoholic beverages. So we then obviously are very fortunate because we've figured this out and we've decided to capture it. And so by doing that in the fermentation vessels, we'll just let it do its little thing. We control the temperature and everything around it so that the yeast, obviously, because it is an organism, we want it to be comfortable and happy so that we get out of it what we want. Yeast can also impart flavor and aroma to our beers. So if you think of like German wheat beers, sometimes people describe them as banana-y. A lot of that comes from the yeast. Or if you get clovey beers as well, a lot of that can come from the yeast. But in today's beers, we won't really have any of those sort of aromas, and we're going to go for more refreshing beers. And so we're going to now, then once it's finished fermenting, again, we're checking it constantly, seeing how much sugar is left over in our fermenters, because the amount of sugar will tell us how much the yeast is eaten and therefore how much ethanol the yeast has produced. And so once we're at the level that we need to be at, we'll effectively drop the temperature in the fermenters, and that will put the yeast to sleep, and it'll also let the yeast fall out of the beers. And so that will help clear up the beers, and that's how now you get, very clear lagers and more hazy pale ales or IPAs, so that by cooling it and keeping it cooled for a longer time, it clears it out. And that's called conditioning. And so in the conditioning stage as well, we can add hops again. So hops in this part impart some bitterness, but a lot of aroma. And so you'll get, by adding different hops together again, it doesn't have to just be one hop. It can be a mix of hops together. We can then give our beers some more flavor and some more aroma and get those very sort of fruity, refreshing, often beers that we get today. And then we'll go through a filtration process. Not all beers at all breweries are filtered. We do filter our beers. That just helps, make sure that the beer is stable and that it is very consistent in its flavor, and that we're not getting some flavors that maybe because we've got, hop matter and yeast left in our beers. We want to make sure that comes out so that when you open a can of Little Creatures Pale Ale tomorrow, or if you do it in 3 weeks' time from a different beer, it'll taste the same. So it helps with stability of the beer as well. And then depending on where it's going, it can either be kegged or canned or bottled. Just quickly check the chat. Yeah, Kathleen, it's beers are very interesting in that people have all sorts of different flavor, obviously, that they like and that they don't like. And that's, I think, something that I thoroughly enjoy about being in this industry, because you've got, as you've mentioned, you've got all sorts of different types of beers and types of flavors that you can get. And the best thing is that a lot of it is this exact process, and it all just depends on the recipe that you're using. So now to touch a little bit more on our key ingredients. So as I mentioned, malt is the base of our beer and also our sugar source. So that sugar, again, is really important for our yeast, because the yeast needs a food source. And so that's why we've got our different malts. And so with our malts, though, as well, sort of just like if you were baking bread and you've got different, you've got wheat, like a wheat loaf or a seedy loaf or anything like that, different malts impart different flavors as well. And not only that, but if we roast the malt, we can get even more flavor from it in a variety of flavor. So some malts we use just for mouthfeel. So if you have something that seems a bit, creamier, that'll come from a certain type of malt. Or if you have a malt stout and you're getting sort of coffee notes or oaky notes, a lot of that will again come because the malt has been roasted in a certain way to give off a certain flavor. Or of course, if you then go all the way to the other end of the spectrum and talk about lagers, crisp and clean, it's very much, obviously, that's a very lightly roasted malt, just to give you a nice easy drinking malt profile and nothing too hard hitting or really, I guess, in your face potentially for flavor wise. So malt obviously influence mouthfeel, aroma, and the color, because obviously if it's more roasted, you'll get a darker beer. And then hops. So hops are on the rise, I'd say, these days. A lot of people are very excited about, how many hops you can add into a beer. And hops are great for aroma and for taste. But initially, a big factor for hops of why it was added is because of its antibacterial characteristic. So this is why people started adding hops to beer back in the day, because it actually helped stabilize the beer. So when they were transporting it long distances, or even, trying to keep it themselves after they've made it, the beer was often turning bad or getting certain off flavors that they didn't want to have. So by adding hops in it, it actually helped stabilize the beer and allowed it to sort of taste the same way for longer, which is obviously great. As I mentioned earlier, on the hot side, so on that top part of the image, that's referred to as the hot side because it's all the cooking process. Adding hops there will give us the bitterness. And then on the cold side, it's aroma and bitterness, but more sort of the aroma aspect of it. And then water. So water is one that is often forgotten about with beer, even though it is a liquid, but people forget how important water is in the brewing process. But if we think back in the day, if you look at London was known for porters, the Czechia, what used to be Czech Republic, was known for pilsners, West Coast IPAs in California. These places could brew these beers because of their water profile. So that's why we couldn't get, crystal clear lagers in the UK or hazy beers in the Czech Republic. And that has a lot to do with the water profile. And yeast. Yeast effectively is the hero of the hour. Yeast is what gives us our alcohol. So without yeast, we cannot produce beer. These are the 4 core ingredients. These are what are written in the purity law, in the German purity law, that you have to classify something as a beer. There are 2 types of yeast. So you've either got a lager or an ale yeast strain, and that will tell us what our beer is at the end of the day. So if I'm brewing something and I add an ale yeast to it, I will end up with an ale. If I have a lager yeast, I'll end up with a lager. You can get mixed fermentation or open fermentation in certain places, but generally speaking, these are the 2 main yeast strains that we use. And then, of course, yeast in itself also adds aroma and taste. So this effectively is what gives us our beer at the end of the day. It is a real art form. There is a lot that goes into it. It's one of the reasons why I think it's a great industry, and why things like brewery tours and tastings are so good, because you get a better understanding of that pint at the end of the day that you're drinking. There's a lot of work that's gone into it, and during the whole process as well, from start to finish, you've got to you check it every day. So the beer is checked every day, as it is, as long as there's yeast in it, it is a living organism. And then even once it's canned and kegged, it gets checked as well. So Suzanne, you get different strength beers by having different amounts of sugar in your recipe. So if I've got, for instance, a low ABV, then I'll add my malt. I'll use different types of malt that have different amount of sugars in them. And so obviously, if there's less sugar for the yeast to eat, there'll be less ethanol produced and therefore less alcohol in my beer. Whereas if I use very high concentrated sugar sources, depending on the different types of malt, you'll get then higher ABV beers. There are also some people will go and add straight sugar to their beers, but that changes the flavor profile, and it isn't something generally that we do, and not really something that most breweries do. But that's how you get your different flavor, your different strength beers. Loving the questions. Please do continue to ask them. I will try and keep an eye on them. So the cooking process, John, is about, with our brewery, every brewery is obviously a bit different, but generally speaking, the cooking process, so the top row up here, that's about 6 hours to cook. And then the bottom depends on the type of beer. So lagers are in for a bit longer than ales, but generally speaking, anywhere from a week to 2 weeks. So it's about from start to finish. When you're looking at beer, it's about a 2-week process, just to be on the safe side. So sour beers are created in a similar process to this, but you would cook it for a bit longer, Angela. So in the brewing process, you could add lactic acid that could influence the sourness of your beer. Or later on, you can also add different sort of flavors or fruit that would make your beer more sour. But generally, it's in that cooking process. You would add lactic acid or things like that would change the profile and make different enzymes work in the cooking process. But it is, sour beers, I think, are an acquired taste. But with all beers, it's very easy to take one sip and think, oh, that's not for me. But you have to think of, have I just had a sip of coffee, or have I just had a really sweet beer or, a beverage, and then I've tried a sour beer, and that really influences. So whenever you guys are tasting beers or wine, or really any food or drink, as hard as it can sometimes be, try to have 1 or 2 sips, and then sort of get a really good understanding of what that flavor is and whether or not you like it. But yeah, so that is the general brewing process and our ingredients. So now let's bring in Australia, the the golden child of the hour. So Australia, how does Australia contribute to beer? So obviously with those 4 ingredients, Australia is a massive hop producing country. So hops are sort of similar to grape, in that obviously you've got great regions in the world, and it's similar with hops. So with our hops, they also are very much influenced by climate and soil. And so depending on where the hop is grown, you'll get different flavor profiles. And so Australian hops have really had a shining moment in the last few years, and people are really starting to love them because they are really floral and fruity, whereas traditional, or what was referred to as noble hops, which is mainly from Europe, as much as they also imparted flavor and aroma, it was a bit more subtle, a bit more not as tropical, I guess. And so whereas these Australian hops, they're really stepping the game up, I'd say, in a lot of places now. If you're drinking craft beer especially, and they call out that individual hop, more often than not, that hop is most likely from Australia or from New Zealand. So they are really having a really shining moment at the time, which is obviously fantastic for them, and also for the rest of the world, because a lot of people are enjoying it. And it means that there's a lot more people trying beer, because of course beer is so vastly different, which is great. The main hop growing regions are in Tasmania, Victoria, and South Australia. That again is just basically mainly about the climate of those areas. And then Australia does also produce their own grains, and that obviously again helps. Obviously you've got 2 of the main ingredients there already, and water is one, is obviously as well, that we've talked about. And then yeast is another thing that is maybe harder to grow, but again, it makes Australia in general a very good place to be if you like craft beer or beer in general. And then if we look again, so Australia's got quite a few different hop varieties. There are about 80 hop varieties in the world that give us different flavors. But oftentimes they all have quite a few different and funny names. So of these 3 that I've given you, which of these do you think is not a real hop name? So we've got Vic Secret, Galaxy, and Green Giant. So which of these do you think isn't an actual hop? John, I'd say it's probably because you've been waiting for it the longest. All right, I'll give you guys a few more seconds to see which of these you think isn't an actual beer. Got votes for all of them at the moment. Galaxy is definitely also a chocolate. Yeah, Andrew and Laura are on it. Galaxy is a hop, and it is a very popular hop at the moment, as is Vic Secret. So the one that isn't a hop in there is Green Giant. So Victoria, Vic Secret, and Galaxy are 2 very popular hops at the minute, and they both impart very tropical and fruity flavors, which is great. And this sort of shows you the sort of different types of flavors that you can get, and these are the main hops that we get from Australia as well. So a couple of different names up there. Some of these may be grown in other places in the world as well, but again, being able to grow them in Australia, even if we can then grow them in, let's say, the States or Germany, they would still have slightly different hop profiles. So these all give us all sorts of different flavors and profiles that a lot of people these days are absolutely loving. Like I mentioned earlier, these ones are very fruity and flavorful, but hops can impart also, as we can see here on the right hand side, spicy type of flavor. So whether that's more clove like or more even chili like, there's all sorts of different things, like different flavor profiles that you can get from hops, which is just great. So they really are effectively the spices of the beer world, which is good fun. And then if we move and have a look, so obviously now that we've seen that how many different types of hops there are in Australia, this is a map of some of the main breweries in Australia. So as you can see, pretty much the entire country is covered in breweries. And they're all often, a lot of them will be known for certain things. So you'll have some breweries that are known just for barrel aged beers or for sour beers, or a lot of breweries focus potentially maybe just on lagers or on stouts. And then of course you've got a few as well that'll be mixed bags, so they'll do a little bit of everything, which is also always exciting. But this is just as something I think is great. There's over 600 breweries. As I mentioned earlier, it's one of the top craft beer destinations in the world at the minute. You could probably, I think it'd be hard to not find a brewery in a tap room in Australia. You'd have to really be trying to not find one. But yeah, so this is always good fun. And I think the reason that it's such a good and a big thing, on top of it obviously being a really good place to get certain ingredients, especially hops, is that the environment that you find in the different tap rooms, especially here, just looking at a couple of them, they're really great places to visit. So similar, like we were talking about earlier, about how, interesting the beer process is, because so many people just don't know about it. Going to the breweries and seeing the different bits of equipment, and pretty much most, if not all of these breweries will do brewery tours, which are always good fun, and tastings. And so it really is just a great place to go and hang out. Good weather or bad weather, I think they're always loads of fun. And it's always also a great place to really meet locals, see what they're loving, and find out where the next place is to go. Always a great time. And these will also be all over the country. So we've got Little Creatures Brewery here on the left-hand side. So that's in Fremantle, which somebody mentioned earlier that they'd been to, which is fantastic. A beautiful brewery. Not their original brewery. Their original brewery actually was set up in an old alligator farm. Then we've got Stone and Wood's new Byron Brewery. This is something that they opened just before COVID kicked off. So unfortunately, it was all finished and ready to go. And then they shut down. So they are very excited to get as many people down as possible. And then White Rabbit is in Melbourne. And they are more of an experimental brewery. So they do a lot of barrel-aged things, as you can see, a couple of different sour beers as well. And these three breweries are very, very well known. And I think you'd struggle to not find their beer as well. But again, going to a tap room in Australia, I think, or in the UK, if you guys are ever obviously at any one of our breweries, great time. But yeah, a really good and always a fun place to be. And all of their locations are always quite great as well. So, tasting time. All right. So I will give everybody a few minutes to go and get the beers. Hopefully, most of you have gotten them. And then if anybody wants to come on screen as well, and we can taste them together, because it's always more fun tasting together than it is to taste alone. Then we can have maybe one or two. I'm not sure what the limit is. But yeah, if anybody wants to come on screen and talk through the beers together, then that would be great. But I'll give you about 2 minutes to go get your beers. I too will pop off quickly and get mine. And then get them, all three of them together as well. We'll taste all three beers together. But yeah, all right, see you in 2 seconds. All right, how are we doing? Has everybody grabbed their beers? Give everybody a few more minutes. That is always the risk of sending beers out before. You never know who's had them already. I guess that's whether it's, even if it's in person, when I've done tastings, people have cheekily had their beer before I've even finished talking. You can if you want, Kate, but it is definitely not a requirement. You are more than welcome to drink. As with any tasting, if you don't like it, please do not feel forced to drink it. But hopefully there's one of them will be to your liking. Awesome, Kathy. If you want to come on, that'd be great. Debbie as well. Give it a couple more minutes. Okay, so as people are hopefully still joining us, if anybody wants to hop on and taste them with me, then just let us know in the chat and we can pull you out and we can talk about them together. Right before we start, so Little Creatures is our main beer and the main beer that we're going to talk about and taste today. You've obviously got 3 in front of you, just to give us all a different sort of flavor, just to showcase how different beer can taste. But Little Creatures is sort of the main beer of the hour. So hopefully most of you will have a Little Creatures can. Hey, Debbie.
Hi.
How are you? Huh? Yay! Oh, I'm so glad they've arrived. Amazing. Awesome. So Little Creatures was born out of sort of a bunch of friends having a lot of fun in their individual breweries, and they wanted to brew beer that they really wanted. So they bought an alligator farm and decided to create their own. So this is one of our top beers. Obviously, if you've been to Creatures at King's Cross, it's obviously a very big seller, which is great. But if we want to try, we can go ahead and try all of our 3 beers. So we want to crack them open. So what we'll do is, if you've got a glass, then that's great. If not, no worries. But we'll try the lager first, then the citrus session, and then the Creatures. So when you're doing tastings, you often want to keep the sort of either stronger ABV beers or the sort of darker beers towards the end, because sort of like if you were going to have a Guinness and then a lager, you'd probably be tasting that Guinness for a while as you were drinking the lager. So generally speaking, you want to go sort of light and crispy to more punchier beers or darker beers. And that just helps to make sure that when you're drinking them, you're getting all the flavor out of it and you're not being drowned out still by, the previous drink.
Do you pour it slowly?
You don't have to necessarily. Some people, when they drink Czech lagers, they often pour it very fast because they want a good head on it. And as much as people often think that, I've been ripped off in the pub because I've been given a huge head, head is actually very important to your drinking experience.
Okay.
It is where a lot of the aromas are trapped. So in that layer of foam, there'll be lots of aromas trapped in there. And obviously, if you don't have that layer of foam, then you've lost all the aromas. So don't go too hard on your bartenders if they've given you far too much. But obviously, within reason as well.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. So first thing we obviously notice with a lot. Oh, you can't even see my beer. With a lot of beers will be the color. So color is always a really good indicator of what we're about to drink. And then that will also sort of give us an idea of potentially the mouthfeel, which is obviously, is it going to be really light and refreshing and crisp, or is it going to be maybe more creamier? So that's always a really good indicator. And then, so color, clarity, and carbonation are the three C's sort of. So obviously we can see some carbonation in here, which is great. And then, of course, the biggest indicator, if we then swirl it round slightly, so by swirling it round, we're breaking the aroma compounds in our beer. And so by doing that, we're releasing that, that hop character or that fruity characteristic that we're getting. And so that, again, is a really good, obviously, a good indicator of whether or not you might like something. Sensory in general with everything is do you or don't you like it? So that's always good. And then I would say probably one of the biggest factors is tasting it. So when we taste things, you want to take usually about 3 sips just to make sure that whatever you've had earlier, potentially in the day, even if it was a curry hours ago, it's not influencing what you're tasting now. So so we can go ahead. Hopefully everybody at home is as well. And tasting it.
Oh, I quite like that.
Yeah. So it's a very, very typical classic lager. So easy drinking, as lagers should be, light in color, and always around that 4% marker.
Yeah, I tend to go for lager more than beers, but
lager. Yeah, I know often with a lot of the IPAs that people, it can be a bit too bitter for a lot of people, or a bit too punchy, which is it's a type of IPA often that, so West Coast IPAs are known to be very bitter, and then you have East Coast IPAs that are more have a lot of a very full-bodied mouthfeel, but they can sometimes be, people refer to them as too green, or you get hop burn, and that's because there's too much hops in there actually, and it's giving you an aftertaste and a mouthfeel that a lot of people don't like. But lagers are traditionally not dry hop, so we haven't added hops on the cold side. It's just in the hot side to give us a bit of bitterness, but not too much aroma. So that's, you get a little bit of floral, but not too crazy on the sort of fruity spectrum. Whereas then if we move to our 4 Pure Citrus Session, so this again it's a type of IPA. So often if you're in a pub or at a restaurant or just at your local shops and you see session or IPA, or pale ale, for instance, these are all different styles of beer. So when you see a session IPA, what they mean by the word session is that it should be sessionable. So it should be easy drinking. It should be around that 4% marker. So you effectively should be able to, refreshing on a summer's day is exactly what it should be. So you should be able to sort of sit there with your mates and have a few and not feel like you are blind drunk. But yeah, so it should be a very easy drinking beer. So this is Four Pure, their tangerine, their citrus session. So there's a lot, you get a lot of floral from that. And a lot of that floral will be from the hops. So this citrus session has got Galaxy and Ella hop in it. So two very fruity hops that come from Australia. So these hops are very much used to give you that fruitiness without potentially adding any fruit to it. So our citrus session has had some tangerine added to it, but a lot of the tangerine is more in the flavor and less on the nose. But it balances out really well with the floral and with the citrus from the Galaxy and the Ella, and also the Cascade hop that's been used in this beer. So by using a combination of everything, you get a really nice sort of, again, easy drinking, but good fruity beer.
Yes, quite nice, quite refreshing.
Yeah, and not too sweet either. I think some people, when they see that fruit's been added to a beer, they get worried that it's going to be overly sweet, but that's the good thing about adding the hops, is that you get the fruitiness and you get the flavor and the aroma without adding, this potentially too much sweetness. If it was like from I guess citrus traditionally isn't that sweet, but often, like if you had a mango or a pineapple, people often wonder if it's going to be too sweet, but a lot of that will come from the hops, which is always good. So quite different from obviously our lager.
Yeah. Yeah, it would be something that I could actually drink, that one.
Yeah, it's always, I think sessions are always good because, or even pale ales when we move to the little creatures. So IPAs are India pale ales, and that was because long time ago when we were shipping beer all around the world, like I said, we were adding a lot of hops to it so that we could move it around the world without it spoiling before it got there. And so by having obviously hops, that obviously adds in that bitterness and that flavor factor. But if we were to go from sort of flavor profile, if we then look at our pale ale, which is the last one, the Little Creatures Pale Ale. So you've effectively, it would be a PA. So it's instead of it being an India pale ale, it's just a pale ale. And this means that it's like we talked earlier about balancing hops and the bitterness from the hops with the sweetness from the malt. So pale ales are very much try to balance that quite equally. If not, keep it quite on this, maybe a bit more sweeter side with the malt. And you get also more of a maltier smell to it, or aroma as well.
It's got more of a head on it as well, I think.
Yeah, it's generally a higher carbonated beer. It's also slightly darker. And a bit hazier as well. But this pale ales are traditionally, they sort of want to equal out quite nicely the sweetness from the malt and then the bitterness from the hop. So whereas when you go to IPAs, then you want to IPAs are about showcasing the hops and sort of saying, this is what this hop can give you, and this is how much flavor you can impart, sort of like I was saying earlier with using different seasonings, and you might want to showcase certain seasoning in a dish. It's sort of a similar thing with the hop. So pale ales are often a good way to get into then trying different IPAs, or session IPAs as well are really good because it's not too punchy or too bitter in your face. It's quite they should both be very easy drinking all through these.
Quite smooth.
Yeah.
It's quite nice. It's not too strong.
Yeah. So the Creatures is a 5.2. 5.2. But yeah, none of them are taste like they're sort of heavy, which is quite nice. So they're all relatively easy drinking. And the Creatures as well is all Australian hop has been used in it, and there's been absolutely no fruit or any sort of additive like that. So all that sweet and that flavor and that aroma that fruitiness that you get is completely from the hops, which is why there are so many breweries in Australia that are doing quite well. But yeah, which is your favorite of those three, would you say, Debbie?
So I did like the lager,
yeah,
because I do like lager,
yeah,
and I find it quite nice in the summer as well to have a
yeah.
lager.
It's hard to beat a good lager on a hot summer's day.
Yeah, so I think probably the lager, and then the fruity one, I think.
Yeah,
I think that was
yeah,
quite nice. I don't know how much of it I could drink.
yeah. It is.
But,
It's definitely, I think, with all of them, it's an acquired taste. I know when I first went into beer, I also was very much lager, and the citrus session actually is what grabbed my attention first. And then it was slowly by drinking that and getting used to different flavors, I then got used to trying and sort of experimenting with different things, just like you would with spices. Like you sort of get used to different spices and try different ones. So these three are, I think, a good sort of variety. And going back, if you then try the creatures again and then go back to the lager and then go back to the citrus and then sort of change them all around, I feel like every time you taste them, you get something else from them, which is quite fun.
I think they were all quite nice. Nothing was, yucky that I was going to go, oh, I really don't like this. But I do, if I go to the pub, I do tend to have a lager anyway. So I'm more of a beer drinker than anything else, really. So
yeah, I think it's good too, because so many people I think craft sometimes scares people because they think like, oh well, what does that mean? Whereas it's nice to sort of have things that are easy drinking and accessible and sort of tasting, and that's why tap rooms are always so great to show people, because it's like, oh, you can get often flights. So if you go to a tap room and they offer flights, you'll usually get a third of either a variety, or maybe they've got a set list, and that's always a really good way of trying different styles as well, without feeling like feeling like you're being rude if you say, oh no, I don't want it, or not knowing what to get. So they're always really good as well. But yeah, lots of variety in beer and lots of different things you can do, which is quite exciting.
Yeah, it's very nice actually.
Yeah, I'm glad.
Thank you.
No worries. I'm glad you guys have hopefully enjoyed it. Hopefully it's been.
We'll probably enjoy the rest of this.
Yeah,
it's a little bit early, but
yeah, I know. People often
after I've cooked my tea.
Yeah, people sometimes have to do tastings quite early in the day, and I was like, people don't usually go back to work after they do a tasting. So yeah, it was fun to have it, and obviously being able to interact even virtually is always good. It's always good. But yeah, looking forward to obviously to getting more people out and about and into tap rooms and traveling. So yeah, should be fun. Yeah. Awesome.
Lovely. Thank you very much.
You're welcome, Debbie. Thanks for joining.
Thank you. How do I get? I don't know.
I'm completely unaware of how this platform works. But yeah.
Do I do disable?
Potentially. Yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, Sarah.
Hey, Maddie, how are you?
Good, thanks. Thank you so much for that. That was so informative, and we've learned so much. And Debbie, thank you for joining on camera. Good to see that you enjoyed your beers there. I'm just hopping on to wrap up the session. So she's off. Yeah. No, fantastic. Thank you again, Sarah. And thank you to everyone who's tuned in to watch.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Hopefully you all enjoyed it, and hopefully you enjoy the rest of the event. It sounds like it's been absolutely brilliant, which is always good.
Yeah, I know it's been good. And the information that you've given and that our other partners given, it's always so valuable to agents. I know they appreciate it because I can see it in the comments. So thank you to everyone who shows appreciation in the comments. We really do appreciate that.
Awesome. Fantastic.